So joining me now to have a longer conversation about the issue of campaign finance issues, campaign finance reform. And the fact of the matter is that I, who was a cynic about money in politics, there's a point where I think we all get to this point, for those of us that cover politics or a part of the world, where you realize, oh my God, this has gotten out of hand. Larry Lessig has been on this issue for decades, on the issue of campaign money and the influence of money in politics. But since Citizens United has tried a bunch of unique ways to drive more attention to this issue that he sees as debilitating to the democracy. He even ran a quixotic campaign for president just simply on a campaign finance, essentially a campaign finance platform, also with voting rights and what I would call the infrastructure of democracy, which you hear me talk about a lot here. But Larry Lessig joins me now because there's a specific issue. He may have found a way to get the Supreme Court to reconsider Citizens United. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. But Larry Lessig of Harvard Law School, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm great. Great to see you again, Chuck. It's been a long time.
Let's talk about the bigger picture here. It's I'll tell you, sort of, there's always been, I always say this about the Trump era. Everybody has a line. It's just not in the same place, right? And eventually Trump crosses a line and that person can't take it anymore, right? Liz Cheney's line was closer than Tom Tillis's line, than so-and-so's line. I think campaign finance reform, I find myself there. It's sort of like, I'm a Jeff Goldblum's character in the first Jurassic Park. When the old man is saying, oh, we've made it, the dinosaurs can't breed, and he says life finds a way. That's kind of my attitude about money in politics. No matter what we do, money finds a way. No matter what law gets written up, a reform gets turned into that. And yet, it was The Wolves of K Street. This is a book written by the Mullins brothers, where lobbying has now gotten to the point where it's no longer the citizens versus corporations. It's corporations versus corporations. Yeah. They've cut out the citizens altogether, and now we have big money being spent just to manipulate corporate regulations that actually have nothing to do with the people themselves. So to say that money and politics have gotten out of hand is an understatement. And yet, traction for this issue is so difficult. You ran for president trying to see if you could get more people interested in this issue. How much do you think about that aspect of this? Because to me, without political will, we can't solve this problem.
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge is that people don't think there's anything that can be done. And so, we all wish we could.
I'll admit that.
Yeah. We wish we could fly like Superman, but we don't jump off of tall buildings. We did a poll we found a long time ago when I started this work, which is not decades ago. It's only 18 years ago, Chuck. So don't make me seem that old.
Every week is a day. Every day is a week,
But we did a poll and we found 96% of Americans thought it important to eliminate, to reduce the impact of money in politics. But 91% didn't think it was possible. So, the 5% who think that it's important and possible, we've been talking to that 5%, but the rest of the people are like, there's nothing to do. So let's move on to the sort of problem we can solve. And I get that. But the point is, there is something to be done. And I think that, in fact, we've got a path to get something done about this, like take care of at least the most important problem, which is super PACs. And once you deal with the super PAC problem, I think that the way people look at this issue right now will lead us to a whole bunch of other reform as well. Because, 18 years ago, this was an important problem. And I wrote a book, Republic Lost, where I spent a long time trying to get people to see the problem. Because at that stage, many people are like, I don't really get the problem. I'm going to work on climate change. And I was like, look, you're not going to deal with climate change until you deal with the money and politics problem. You're not going to deal with healthcare until you deal with the money and politics problem. And back then, people were like, I don't quite get it. But now, everybody gets it. There's nobody who's missing this point right now. And Pew reports for the first time after the 2024 election, money in politics is the number one issue people talk about, number one issue that's got to be solved. And so I think we're at this moment where finally people have come around to recognizing why this is the critical thing to solve, whether you're on the right or on the left.
Look, you brought up healthcare and climate. I would throw in the national debt. And
Absolutely.
I made this argument on my Substack a couple weeks ago that I call them dead rail issues, right? You have third rail issues you don't touch, the dead rail issues where voters, where there's an agreement, there's a problem, but voters just don't react to it. You gave, I think the debt is another one of those like campaign finance issues. Yeah, we know it's a problem. They're never going to do anything about it. So let me get my benefits first, and then we'll worry about the debt later. I guess the question I have to sort of reacting to that is whether is it possible that this renewed interest is because Donald Trump is so upfront about pay to play? I mean,
Yeah.
he doesn't hide it, right? This has always been what it is. We are a full on pay to play democracy right now,
Yeah.
right? Elon Musk all but says it. In fact, he's like wondering, like, what do you mean I don't get my NASA guy, right? I spent all this money. Like I thought that meant I got my NASA guy. Well, I did get this contract and I get that contract. And all of Washington is operating like, well, we don't want it to be pay to play, but this is the rules of the game. Ask Paramount and Skydance, right? Ask Disney. In a weird way, is that helpful to your cause, you think?
Absolutely. I mean, Mike Johnson was interviewed about his obsession with Biden and the corruption of Biden.
I
And
know
like,
where you're
why
going.
was
I love this. Go tell
yeah,
your version of it. I find
yeah.
it
So,
hilarious.
like, why was he so obsessed with Biden's corruption, which is tiny compared to the what's going on with the Trump administration? And his response was, Joe Biden hid it. And Donald Trump is out in the open, as if that makes it better. That makes it worse. That
Larry,
makes
when
it
you
worse.
shoplift, if you wave to the camera when you walk out of the store, right? Like, hey, hi, I'm shoplifting. Hi,
Absolutely.
Mr. CVS.
Yeah.
I'm doing it in plain sight.
So the point is, like, we live in this world where everybody kind of thinks that's the way the system is working, which is exactly why I think it's the moment when we can finally get the court to do the right thing. Now, you said at the top that what we're trying to get the court to do is to reconsider Citizens United. False. We're not challenging Citizens United at all. What we're saying is embrace the logic of Citizens United. Consider a question you've never considered and apply that logic to that question. And if you do, you'll agree with us that super PACs are not actually constitutional.
So the question is what? Explain the question you want.
Right. So in Citizens United, the question was whether you could spend unlimited amounts of money independent of a campaign. And the logic of the court was the only basis for limiting political speech is if there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption, this for that corruption. And the logic, according to Justice Kennedy in that opinion, was if the spending is independent, by definition, quote unquote, that's what he said, by definition, it's not quid pro quo. Or another way to think about that is if there's a quid pro quo, it's not independent. So that's why there could be no limit on the amount of money you spend. Okay, 3 months after Citizens United, a lower court, the DC Circuit, in a case called Speech Now, addressed the question of whether you could contribute unlimited amounts of money to a committee that's then going to spend its money in the political campaign independently. And the court said, if you can spend unlimited amounts of money, because the government has no interest in limiting that, then the government wouldn't have any interest in limiting the contribution either. So as a matter of logic, it followed that you could contribute unlimited amounts of money if you could spend unlimited amounts of money. And it has a kind of superficial logic to it. But that's the decision that created the super PAC. Now,
let me pause right there. Let me pause right there because there's another piece of this logic that I've actually never understood. Why are there contribution limits for political candidates then by that logic? What you just explained to me then because there's in theory an unlimited amount of money as a candidate you can spend. It all just depends on how much you can raise.
Right. So a campaign can spend as much as they want. The question is just whether they can receive contributions of unlimited size. And what the court has said is, look, if you're giving money to a campaign, there's an obvious risk of quid pro quo corruption. This is what the Supreme Court held in Buckley versus Vallejo 50 years ago in January. So because there's the risk of quid pro quo corruption, you're dealing with the campaign. That's why you can limit the size of the contribution to the campaign. But Citizens United addressed the case where you're not having anything to do with the campaign. like you're spending your money independently. So if you're running a super PAC, you tell your workers in the super PAC, don't coordinate with the campaign, don't talk to the campaign. And if you do that, we can spend whatever money we have. They can't limit the amount we're going to spend because there's no risk of quid pro quo corruption there.
So that brings us to, so what you're arguing, the question you're arguing is that if campaigns can spend unlimited money, but you can limit the amount of contribution, then in theory, you can limit a contribution to a super PAC. You're not infringing upon the Citizen United decision, which says, so these PACs in Maine, so the law that was passed by referendum in Maine says there's a limit, $5,000 to a super PAC. It does not say the super PAC is limited in how much it can spend, correct?
Exactly. In the logic, the reason why this is obvious is, what the court said in DC, in the DC Circuit speech now, was there is no risk of quid pro quo corruption with a contribution to what became a super PAC. All right. Then 5 years later, my favorite United States Senator, Robert Menendez, was indicted in 2015. And the indictment was Robert Menendez engaged in a quid pro quo. The quid pro quo was he was going to do favors for a Florida businessman. And the Florida businessman was going to make a contribution to Menendez's super PAC. So there it was, a quid pro quo involving a contribution to a super PAC. And so that was the indictment. Menendez's lawyers had the chutzpah to file a motion to dismiss. And their argument was, the thing you've indicted us for, the DC Circuit said cannot happen. So therefore, we can't be guilty here. And of course, that was ridiculous, but it pointed out the logic in the error in the logic of the DC Circuit. Because yes, of course, there could be a quid pro quo involved in the contribution, because there's nothing controlling the contribution. Just think if you're running a super PAC, you can control your employees. You can tell them, do not talk to the campaign. But you get a check in the mail for $1 million. You don't know where that check comes from. You don't know why that check is there. So the point is, there is obviously the risk of quid pro quo corruption. And if there's that risk, what the Supreme Court has said again and again and again, and in Citizens United and in McCutcheon afterwards, is that risk is the justification for the regulation to limit contributions. And so that's why that question was just wrongly decided. And for 15 years, we've now lived with the consequence of that mistake.
So timing wise, when do you think you can get this to the Supreme Court? You want this to the Supreme Court, right? Yeah. The organizers of this ballot initiative want everything that has happened. It passed, 75% are pretty close, right? Yeah. This is Maine. They're pretty what I'd call good government types, right? They sort of are usually pretty, they fall for those appeals. It immediately, there was a suit filed against it, right? Claiming it was unconstitutional. So give me your time, this world well. When do you think this court will hear it?
Well, so the DC Circuit heard the case in May. We actually expected the decision today because this is the day that the Maine Attorney General said that.
By the way, today we're taping on July 15th. This is going to drop in a couple days, but I just wanted, we're taping Tuesday, July 15th. You'll be hearing this later in the week. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we should know today by the end of the day. She was a great, great judge. She spent 3 hours interrogating the lawyers. Our lawyer is Neil Katyal, who just did a fantastic job. And Neil's argument was both the quid pro quo argument that I've just argued here, but also an argument nobody's ever made in the context of these cases, which is an argument grounded in originalism. You might, I don't know if you knew this, but Josh Hawley, a year ago, introduced a bill to overturn Citizens United. And when he did that, he said, look, as every originalist knows, there's nothing in the original meaning of the First Amendment that would restrict the ability of Congress to control how corporations spend their money. And he is right. The original meaning of the First Amendment would have nothing to say about these questions of campaign finance. So what Neil argued was both, this is the quid pro quo standard that Chief Justice Roberts has set, and under that standard we win. And oh, by the way, for any originalist who wants to be consistent in their originalism, and you might be skeptical about whether there are those people, but I clerked for one early in his career. Justice Scalia early on wanted to be consistent in his originalism. For those originalists, if they want to be consistent in originalism, they will also agree with this conclusion too. So he made both of those arguments. The judge held them for 3 hours of oral argument.
Who was your judge? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Her name is Wolf, and she's actually a magistrate judge. But she, I think, is the first federal judge to actually understand the issue. Her questions were brilliant. Now, we don't need to win in the DC in the district court.
It doesn't matter win or lose. This is getting appealed, right?
Yeah.
Either side.
So it's going to the First Circuit. And the great thing about the First Circuit is it's never considered the question. So we have an open field in the First Circuit. And the First Circuit's a great circuit. They've got super judges. So we think we have a clear shot in the First Circuit. So that means if she decides today, in the fall, we will be in the First Circuit. That means the First Circuit can decide by the spring of 26, which means we could be in the Supreme Court in the fall of 26, after the election of 26, because you don't want to be in the middle of an election to decide this kind of question. And so the Supreme Court could, in 26 or 27, decide this question. Now, I want it to be 26 because that's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So we will declare ourselves independent of super PACs or have another reason for a revolution. But either way, it's a victory.
Well, okay, so let's play this out. You get this ruling that says you can limit the contributions of super PACs. Doesn't that mean that Congress has to pass a law limiting the contributions to super PACs?
No, because there's a law on the books that the DC Circuit struck down, and it has not been removed from the book. So remember, after Dobbs, there are all those laws that regulated abortion. They came back to life. That's the same thing here.
So there's a dormant law here.
Dormant law.
What is the dormant law?
The dormant law, just like the main law, says that you are limited in the size of contributions you can make to an independent political action committee to $5,000. So these committees can raise $5,000 from anybody. And then if they raise $5,000 from 1 million people, they can spend a lot of money in the campaign. But the point is, they are limited in the size of their contribution. And that would basically end the super PAC.
Wow. So that is it feels like Luke Skywalker having to be able to get that that shot right in the right spot. And you blow up the whole Death Star. I mean, it sounds so plausible. What am I missing here? Where's the piano that's going to fall on your head?
Look, the court doesn't have to decide cases in a principled way. I'm the last naive law professor who actually thinks they want to decide in a principled way. And in this case, there's no argument against deciding in a principled way. This money doesn't benefit the Republicans anymore. It used to. 10 years ago, it was the Republicans who raised way more than the Democrats. Now the Democrats raise as much as the Republicans. Indeed, if you take Elon out, they raise more than the Republicans. Mm-hmm. So it's not like either side is winning. It's just an arms race. From the Supreme Court's perspective, they would love to be able to decide a case and say, look, we're just applying our principles to this question. And, it turns out the answer is an answer all of us like you like on the left and we like on the right, just because it applies our principles in a consistent way. So I don't see the reason why they would want to decide this in a way that continues the disgusting system that everybody now recognizes is destroying the integrity of our political process. So we just have to get to them, and we have to get to them by winning in the First Circuit, because if we win in the First Circuit, they have to take the case up. If we don't win, they don't have to take the case up. Now, the reason why, this seems like a Luke Skywalker move is that 99% of the people, especially lawyers, think that they know the answer to this question simply when you ask it, which is, will the Supreme Court limit money in politics? Simple answer, no. And that's because everybody's thinking about it at 50,000 feet. Indeed, when I first reached out to Neil,
they already decide money is speech.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what I would have assumed here.
Yeah. And so when I first reached out to Neil was like, yeah, no, there's just no way. And then I said, look, just have lunch with me. And then over the course of lunch, there was a certain moment it was like, holy shit, I think you're right. I think there is an argument here that they, in a principled way, would follow. And so this is not just, I mean, it's clearly the best shot we've got to end these super PACs. I mean, there are people trying to get an amendment to the Constitution to overturn Citizens United, and God bless them. But, you need at least 16 Republicans in the United States Senate, and I don't know if they have one who's willing to do that. So push for it all you want. But the point is, here is a way to get at least 80% of the problem solved. If we can get them to apply their principles in a consistent way and say that, yes, a state and Congress can regulate contributions even if they can't regulate spending.
It seems to me, so you're not to say you target certain justices, but I guess I look at it and I'm looking, well, the justices that you might win over on that originalist argument, I guess, are Barrett and Gorsuch.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The two Scalia wannabes. I mean, when I clerked for Scalia, it was early in his career, but there are any number of cases where, Scalia was torn between the conservative thing to do and the originalist thing to do. And in every one of those cases,
70% of the time he went the predictable way, but there was always about 1 in 3 times he'd go.
Yeah, but early in his career, he always went to the originalist answer. Like later in his career, he became a different kind of justice.
More political.
Yeah, but early in his career, it was like, if you had the argument, you could show him the originalist answer. He's like, okay, fine. I don't like it, but I'll do it. That's the right answer. And
based on what you've seen of these justices, Gorsuch.
Yeah, I think Barrett and Gorsuch both are, they believe they have a principle. They believe they're trying to apply their principle in a principled way. They want to demonstrate that. I mean, look at Gorsuch and the same-sex Title VII action, right, in the Bostock case, which, that was an answer that followed from his principles about how you read a statute. Even though, it was completely inconsistent with the politics of the right, it was the right answer from his perspective. And I think that's the same thing that we have to tee up here. And, that's a hard lift because it is weird, but in the 50 years since Buckley versus Vallejo, the case that set up campaign finance law, literally, there's never been a moment when the court has considered the original meaning of the First Amendment as it applies to campaign finance. And every time you get an originalist to look at that, they're like, no, that's completely
So let's go back to this. So basically, the argument is nobody was thinking about corporations when the First Amendment was written. Is that the argument?
There are two versions of the argument. The most extreme version is basically Justice Thomas. Justice Thomas is trying to get New York Times versus Sullivan reversed. And he says New York Times versus Sullivan is just policy making dressed up as constitutional law. He said what we should be doing is going back to the framing and ask, what would the framers have said about the First Amendment and defamation questions? And the answer is, they would have said defamation actions are not affected by the First Amendment. And so therefore, there is no special privilege that the press gets under the New York Times versus Sullivan standard. Well, I want to say to Justice Thomas, if you think New York Times versus Sullivan is policymaking dressed up as law, have you ever read Buckley versus Vallejo? It's the most complicated scheme of policymaking, constitutional policymaking, dressed up in this completely made up structure for adjudicating whether Congress can regulate in the context of campaigns. So if you apply Thomas's standard and you ask, what would the framers have said? We have briefs by both Jack Rakoff Jack Rakoff is the one that's, historically been the most important in this context. I mean, he's actually now twice weighed in on this question. And his, basic argument that he's pushing is that in the framing context, there would have been no argument that the First Amendment would be restricting this type of speech. And so therefore, from the original's perspective, we should win. Now, again, whether they'll take this up, whether they'll address it, or the simpler thing for them to do is to say, originalism gives me a reason why I should follow the standard Chief Justice Roberts has. And under Chief Justice Roberts' standard, the question is there a risk of quid pro quo corruption? And we've seen it. We can point to it. We can point to particular examples. Menendez is one. But, we could also, we're not going to mention it, obviously, but you could also look at just at the president. The president in April of 2024 had that talk to the oil executives where he said, raise $1 billion for me and I'll relax oil regulations on day one. Well, the only way you relax oil, you raise $1 billion is by giving to a super PAC. So there it is, right. A quid pro quo involving a contribution to a super PAC, which is exactly the sort of thing that entitles Congress to regulate.
Obviously, let's say this happens. Let's say you win. My expectation would be that there would be an immediate attempt to then create a new set of standards for super PACs on the federal level. Would that be your expectation? And of course,
yeah.
You'd be
Absolutely. They can change.
So
the
they
law.
would probably, maybe they'd go to 100,000 or 1 million or something like that. Is that what you assume would happen?
I assume that they will try to change the law, and I would love to have that fight.
Right, it's a public debate.
Yeah, because right now the public would be kind of outraged. It's the same kind of. This is why this is such an important issue, that people on both sides get this issue. Like when I gathered signatures for this initiative in Maine on Election Day 2023, I went to a place called Hollis, Maine, which is a relatively conservative place. And I stood there for 13 hours gathering signatures. And in the first hour, a guy came up to me and he said, I'm here gathering signatures to get Donald Trump on the ballot. What are you here for? And I said, oh my gosh. And so I handed him my initiative and he read it and he said, hell yes. And he said, I'm signing this and I'm going to get every one of my guys to come over and sign it. And that's what he did by the time he was there. Every Trump supporter came over and signed this. Because remember, in 2015, when we spoke, Donald Trump was a big anti-super PAC guy. Super PACs were a corruption. That's what he said.
It was hurting him.
Yeah, it was hurting him.
That's why he didn't like it. It was hurting him.
Well, that's right. But, the point is, nobody should be like demanding unilateral disarmament. If that's the system, you live by the system, you play by the system, you do what the system allows you to do, but you should also be arguing to change the system to make it into a better system. So I think, there's no inconsistency between saying we're going to run our campaign, we're going to get as many super PAC dollars as we can. Thank you, Elon. But at the same time saying this is a corrupt system and we need to get back to a system which doesn't give like these tiny group of billionaires the ability to basically decide what's possible in American politics.
No, it's created an industry. What I've always said about these campaigns, there's entire economies that have been created due to this spending in the super PAC. There's a lot of wealthy political consultants now who couldn't have gotten nearly this wealthy without it. And those are, in this case, what I guess would be the special interest that would be trying to change it. What if this doesn't work, then what?
Yeah. Well, if this doesn't work, then it's, the only thing is to amend the Constitution. And here there's another conversation to be had about what's the way to amend the Constitution. Liberals hate the idea of using a convention to amend the Constitution. The Constitution gives us two ways to amend. One's an Article 5 convention. The other is Congress proposes. Right. And they're terrified about a convention because they believe a convention will run away. That argument's never been good. But because of a case I lost 9-0 in the Supreme Court, that argument is no longer even plausible. So, I took the case to the Supreme Court asking the question whether presidential electors were constitutionally free to vote their conscience, regardless of being instructed by the state legislatures of how they had to vote. 9-0, the Supreme Court said, nope, state legislatures can tell presidential electors how they must vote. Well, talk about my understanding of, I didn't go to law school, but I've played a lawyer plenty of times now on television these days. I've never understood the logic of that. The Constitution says what it says. Yeah.
And if you're an originalist, you go by what the Constitution, nowhere in there does it say the elector has to abide by what the state either vote tells them to do or the state legislature tells them to do.
Don't get me started.
What was the logic of your loss?
Well, the logic was we were in the middle of the pandemic. This was a race with Donald Trump. They were not going to create this other layer of uncertainty. most of the argument was focused on bribery, like whether these electors would be bribed. Look, there's literally never been a single allegation of an elector bribed in the history of the United States. But, still, that was their upset. So I understand why they did what they did. And I kind of am happy right now. I mean, we took the case just because we thought we needed to resolve this before it created a constitutional crisis, because, we resolved it in a context where either way they went, it wasn't going to pick the president. But, if you were in the middle of a actual contest and some electors vote one way and that's picking the president or not picking the president, that's creating a constitutional.
My poor friend Jeff Greenfield wrote a whole novel about faithless electors, and and now the Supreme Court in this case has totally made it where you can't even we can't even fantasize about that anymore.
But the point is, look, if you can control presidential electors, something that's in the Constitution, you certainly can control delegates to an Article 5 convention. So you could tell delegates to the Article 5 convention, you can't run away. And if you do try to run away, then the mechanism the Supreme Court approved for the electors is you could automatically kick them out and you could replace them with somebody who's not going to run away. So we could control a convention. And so I've been working with conservatives who are trying to get to a convention to say we need a convention because there are a bunch of things we should be able to agree on.
I was just going to say in 2016, Greg Abbott, as governor of Texas, was a big advocate of this. He had a bunch of consultants. And essentially it was pretty clear to me they assumed Trump was going to lose, and it was clear what they were up to. They thought we will be the conservative energy point, tip of the spear by with Hillary Clinton in the White House, we're going to rewrite the Constitution. Let's have a good old-fashioned constitutional convention. And then Trump wins, and all of those efforts, they all went on the back burner and they all got shelved. But there has been a fairly consistent group of conservatives pining for this for some time, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not all gone away. In fact, they think they now have enough resolutions. And they've been teeing up the idea of trying to get litigation to force Congress to count it. Now, I don't think that litigation goes anywhere because I think it's a political question.
Let's take a step back. Let's assume this happens in 2029, because I think that's when the energy would be there, right? It'd be after our next presidential election. What would it take to start I guess, convene a constitutional convention? What is it that's necessary?
Yeah, well, I mean, all it takes is for Congress to recognize 34 states have called for one. And if 34 states have called for one,
how many states have?
So with the balanced budget one, they think that they have 34, but it's probably closer to 30, given the number who have
This is for the balanced budget amendment, right?
Yeah, right.
Yep.
And then the question is is it limited just to that? And would other resolutions come up? So I think that, there's a big push in Maine, for example, to tie term limits to campaign finance as a proposal. And I think you could see that happening in a bunch of places. I mean,
how about age limits? Because I think you cannot do age limits outside the Constitution.
Yeah.
Because the Constitution says how old you have to be to run the first time. That means you're going to need a constitutional amendment to then say how old is too old.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a bunch that would be popular. Age limit, I think ending immunity, presidential immunity, is kind of an outrageous idea that presidents are immune. I mean, there are a bunch of things where we should be able to get liberals and conservatives to agree on principles that unite. And so, if you take fiscal integrity and representational integrity, that's what campaign finance is about. That's what term limits is about. And maybe integrity of the government process itself. There's a lot of reasons why people agree on the need for an amendment. And the thing to recognize about an amendment is it's never partisan. You don't have, except for the Civil War amendments, where basically the Republicans at the barrel of a gun told the states they had to adopt it or they weren't going to be part of the union anymore. We've never had amendments that were partisan. They were always endorsed and supported by both sides. And so that's what this process would have to be. Now, the thing about the Money in Politics Amendment is that it increasingly is. Indeed, there's a great group called American Promise who's been out there pushing the idea of getting an amendment to the Constitution. Their strategy has been to try to get Congress to propose an amendment. So what they've done is they've gone to all these states and they've gotten state legislatures to pass resolutions telling Congress that they ought to propose an amendment. Now, I want them to have resolutions that say, Congress propose an amendment, and if you don't, then this converts into a call for an Article 5 convention, but they haven't done that yet. But I was at an event where they were describing their progress, and the latest state to join is Utah. And Utah, almost unanimously in the Utah legislature, passed a call for Congress to pass an amendment to overturn Citizens United. And if you talk to the people in Utah, what the Utah legislators say is, why do the blue states want this? Because obviously the runaway spending, the runaway campaign finance is all benefiting the blue states. And if you talk to the blue states people, they're like, why would the red states ever want this? But the point is, red and blue never talk to each other. And if you get them to begin to talk to each other, both sides would realize that we don't like this system where this money is in.
So one thing I just want to clarify, and what's not clear, and maybe this isn't clear, if there are 34 states for the balanced budget amendment, and says, okay, we've got to convene to talk about a balanced budget amendment, a convention. What's not clear is whether other amendments can be considered at that same convention, right? That's what I was just trying to clarify.
Yeah. So under the rules that have been drafted for this convention, the only issues that can be considered are those that 34 states have endorsed as a issue to be considered at the convention. Now, constitutionalists will say, actually, there's no way to limit what a convention does. But again, I think that legislatures could say to their delegates, you can't vote to consider anything except the following three issues, or you cannot vote for this issue, or you have to vote for that issue. So I think that problem can be controlled. But
paint the picture, who would convene it? Let's say we get there.
So Congress is the one who convenes it, and then it's run by the states in the convention. I mean, they convene it, and then they meet and they start deliberating. There's an argument about whether the states ultimately control what happens or whether it's under the rules Congress sets. So there's a bunch of questions that have to be addressed or answered. But I think one hopeful scenario is you see one convention and it works, that doesn't run away, it considers and it proposes an amendment. Whether it passes or not is not really the point. And then you say, well, what else should we be able to consider? Because we know Congress is never going to propose a constitutional amendment. It is never going to get 2/3 of Congress to agree on anything. So let's talk about the issues where we know Americans are united in the need for that reform. So money and politics would be the next one. Term limits probably are on that list. Maybe age limits, maybe ending immunity. But the point is, there's a long list of things we actually agree on, even if it doesn't pay for the politicians to talk about those issues, because division is what pays in Washington.
I just wrapped up an interview with the historian that runs the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon, Lindsay Shervinsky, and one of my favorite questions that I've done interviews with her a few times, is what would be the most surprising thing to founders if they came back today? And she said, the lack of amendments in the Constitution. Yeah. That the founders assumed that when they proposed that Bill of Rights, that there'd be, and in fact, she said, if you ask them, they assume that Constitution itself would have only lasted maybe 25 years until a new one was written. That there was that the fact that we've stuck with one and have only amended it arguably 18 times since the Bill of Rights would astonish the founders the most. Do you concur with that?
I do. And I think part of the reason we haven't seen more amendments is the way that the convention movement has been stifled. Because if you think about some of the critical amendments, the Bill of Rights is proposed by Congress only because the alternative was a convention. They were talking about having another convention to propose amendments. Madison's like, that's a disaster. No, we're going to propose these Bill of Rights. And then if you think about the progressive amendments, the Senate, electing the Senate amendment happened because they came within one vote of enough states calling for a convention, and Congress was terrified. They're like, oh my God, if there's a convention, who knows what they'll propose? So,
I didn't realize that origin, that we got direct election as senators. It was like, fine, we'll do it. Please, we don't want a convention.
That's right, because they didn't know what would happen. And that's the same thing that, happened almost with the balanced budget amendment. In the 80s, they came very close, and then they struck a deal. They said, we'll pass the Graham-Rudman-Hollings framework to make sure that we take care of the deficit. Of course, that didn't actually have the effect, but it pulled people back from a convention. But there's been this deep push, especially now on the left. Originally, it was on the right. The John Birchers were like deeply concerned about a convention. But now it's on the left that people are like, this would be the end of the Constitution. I think we've got to get beyond that and recognize this is the only way to amend our Constitution, and our Constitution desperately needs to be amended. And the one I care about is money, but I would never say that's the only amendment.
Well, and Larry, how about let's consider the fact, if you're afraid of the people, then maybe our democracy's already dead. Like, trust them. I always say this. I trust the voters to get it right eventually.
Yes.
I mean, voters don't always get it. You don't always do what I want them to do, but eventually they do. Yeah, because I'm a logic person, and I always feel like eventually logic will win out. Sometimes it takes the second kick to the head by the mule. Not one. Maybe you need two kicks. One of my favorite Mitch McConnellisms.
This is the part that depresses me the most about this argument. I was, it was with Cenk Uygur, who's like runs Young Turks, who's been pushing for a convention for a long time. We were talking to a friend who's like a very prominent leader blocking the convention on the left. And this was before the Hillary Clinton election. And he, at the end of our conversation, said, okay, I get it. I see your point, but like, why risk it? Like, Hillary will be elected. She'll appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, and they will give us everything we want. And it was like, oh my God, if you can't trust the people at all, then why are we doing what we're doing here? I mean, if it's only lawyers who are allowed to touch the Constitution, then it's no longer a Constitution of the people of the United States. And oh, by the way, Hillary didn't win, and we're not going to get justices who are going to give you what you want. So you're going to get to do it the old-fashioned way, which is actually to persuade people this is what the Constitution Amendment needs.
My word, and we could imagine. Look, I look at everything as an opportunity to teach civics. When we have these sort of crises, I mean, we are in desperate need of revitalizing some of this. And, citizenship has duties to it. And I think sometimes we fail to ask the citizens to be citizens sometimes. And a constitutional convention is one of those moments where, no, this is one of those times. You need to be a citizen. You got some work to do.
Yeah, no, the idea I've been pushing for the convention is to imagine, I don't know if you've talked about citizen assemblies, which are these things that are spreading out all across the world, but just basically random representative group of people from the state or from the nation that are convened. They're given information about the issue, and then they sit down and they deliberate on it, and then they give their views, both before they start deliberating and after. Citizen assemblies, is what Ireland used to propose ending regulation of abortion or blocking of abortion, and supported same-sex marriage, 2 ideas that never would have come from the Irish legislature. But there's been happening all across the world, and it's slowly happening in the United States. But my idea is, why do we have citizen assemblies in the states to review these proposed constitutional amendments? Like, you get a random selection of 300 people from the state, random representative. Give them the information, let them hear both sides, and let them think about it. And after you do that for a while, people begin to see that these assemblies are actually very sensible. People don't think about that like that, because right now when they think about the random person, they think about the random crazy person, because that's all you see on social media, right? But the random representative American is like, that population is actually pretty decent. Like, there are crazies on the extremes, but most people are not crazy. So if you see that these assemblies begin to do sensible things, then imagine a state saying, no delegate from the state of Massachusetts can vote for a proposed amendment at an Article 5 convention that's not supported by 60% of the Citizen Assembly of Massachusetts. So now you've constrained the amendment
You've tied
process.
this to your the electoral college issue that you just
the same issue as the electoral college. But now you tie it to a democratic process, which is better than any democratic process we've got, better than referenda, because you're not spending money to get people to see one way or the other. And so now you could tie the amendment process to a democratic process that would actually make it better than anything we've ever had. But it takes what you're describing, the recognition that we've got to get back to people believing they have a role, they have a duty, they're part of the Constitution.
It is so clear when I sort of, and obviously it's always easier to be clear-eyed when you've stepped away from something. But as I left NBC, when you look at the problem that the journalism has, and I look at the problem politics has, it's actually the same thing. We've lost touch on the ground.
Mm.
So in journalism, it's local, right? Local's gone away. In politics, I would argue it's we feel so distant. You know, one of my pet agendas is to uncap the House, right? Not something you don't need a constitution. You know, you don't like the Electoral College, double the size of the House, and I promise you the Electoral College and the popular vote will, 99.5% of the time be aligned rather than the shockingly often case now that we're going to have in our current makeup. And it is what you're describing in a constitutional convention, or if we can uncap the House where there's, yes, I've had people say, well, that's too many members of Congress. It'll get unruly. Well, we're 350 million people now.
Mm.
So we're pretty unruly as it is. It's supposed to be a representative democracy. 1 per 800,000. That's how you get factionalism within each congressional district, because you don't need but one of every 400,000. The likelihood that you're representing a community of interest has literally doubled.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I like that change, but it's not enough, right?
No, I get that. I was always thinking of changes that you can do to avoid a constitutional amendment, right?
Yeah.
Avoid running into a constitutional question.
Right. But imagine you said that in the states, the presidential electors have to divide their vote fractionally according to the proportion of votes in the state. Because the single biggest problem with the Electoral College right now is not the 1 out of every 9 elections where there's an inversion between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. It's the every election where the only votes that matter are the votes from 7 states, the swing states, right? So presidential campaigns focus on just those states, and the rest of the country is left out. And they bend their policies to pervert whatever those states might happen to want, because they know those are the people. But if you allocate,
why is ethanol? I always say this: why is ethanol a part of our?
There's only one reason, because
that's right.
Iowa's a swing state. Yeah.
And
but if you divided the votes in a fractional way, so that if you get 54% of the vote in the state, you get exactly 54% of the electors in the state, then every vote across the country matters. It's just as important to get votes in California as it is to get votes in Pennsylvania. Now, still, the small states have more weight because the way the Electoral College is allocated, small states have more. But the thing about small states is that the smallest states are perfectly balanced between red and blue. The smallest 10 states are 5 red, 5 blue. So it would be more small state pressure, but it would be pressure that allows every state vote to every state to matter. And the hard question, which more I think about it, I think the answer is obvious, is whether you need an amendment to do that. And the answer, I think, is no. I think
you don't think you need an amendment to fractional. Well, I guess you don't. Maine and Nebraska do what they do because ultimately the state. So actually, I believe, because I remember the state of Pennsylvania actually proposed this. It was Pennsylvania Republicans I want to say in the first decade of this century, because they kept, remember Pennsylvania, even, I think carried Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. Like Pennsylvania had been starting to trend blue, and it would bothering Republicans there. And there was this proposal to split to do winner by congressional district, if I'm not mistaken.
But which is different. And it's not,
slightly different than what you're describing.
And it's not a solution because gerrymandering screws that up.
Correct. Right? But this is a state. The point is the state legislatures could decide whether an elector has to be connected to the vote or not, which also means the state legislature can propose a different way to deliver the electoral votes.
Exactly. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says it's got to be a whole vote that the elector casts. And of course, there's nothing new in the idea of fractional votes. So if the state legislature has all the power, which is what the case I lost said, it's all the state legislature, then if the state legislature says we're going to allocate all these votes like this, and then the final vote will be allocated in a fractional way. So 0.42 will go to one candidate and 0.58 will go to the other candidate. Then, I don't think the question is whether the parliamentarian accepts it. No reason why she shouldn't accept it. And if she accepts it, then that's it. We've got a way to fractionally divide it.
I always think about like what could be the unintended consequence. You may have some states that say, no, we're going to be winner take all as a way to entice being more important
Yeah,
versus, all right. Because if you fractional, then suddenly, and you know, if Pennsylvania makes it fractional, but Wisconsin doesn't,
right.
then in theory, Wisconsin's more valuable than Pennsylvania is,
Right.
even
But
though
it's only
Pennsylvania has quote
valuable if
unquote more electoral votes.
it's only valuable if you're actually a swing state. And of course, the vast majority, 42
Touche.
states, are not swing states. 43
Right.
states are not swing states. So for 43 states, winner take all makes them less powerful. And if they had fractional voting, they'd be more powerful. So it might be that some states want to continue to be winner take all. Fine,
Right.
let them. But the point is, the rest of the country will not be winner take all. And so they will matter to the presidential election in a way that right now they do not. So,
Well, I'll tell you, that constitutional convention you're going to convene, Larry, and I'm on board, man. Count me in. I'd love to be the parliamentarian. Actually, that'd be a lot of fun. But that constitutional convention, there's going to be somebody that proposes eliminating the electoral college and going to direct popular vote.
Yeah. And, you know, my first preference would be that makes sense. But I think the reality is there's an America where a significant portion of America thinks the electoral college is a critical part of what we have. Okay, fine. So second best is fractional allocation of electoral votes. If you do that, then keep the electoral college. Small states get an advantage, but at least you make it so the president is appealing to the whole country for his or her election, not just to the 7 swing states that happen to be actually competitive.
All right, I want to nerd out one more thing. How about multi-member districts?
I love it. I love it. It's like,
you know one of my favorite, let me finish this thought and then get you to fully comment. I always joke, I used to defend the Electoral College. And I remember trying to explain it to international reporters once. And then you're just like, you know what? It's not one person, one vote. And the minute you get lost in one person, one vote. But I've had a lot of friends who've participated in IRI or NDI, right, which is the international arms of the Republican and Democratic Party. And actually, it's a tremendous nonprofit that the two parties, it's one of the few things the two parties do together that's great. They observe elections overseas. The idea was it's spreading democracy, help fledgling democracy set up, how to run a political convention, how to run a caucus, things like this. And one of the things I've always noticed is that whenever we're proposing a system on a country that wants to start a democracy, we always recommend multi-member districts.
Yeah.
But we don't do it in our own country. Yeah. We realize, well, you got to give every tribe a seat at the table, or or this democracy will never get off the ground. That's basically the thinking.
Yeah.
And I've never understood why multi-member districts are not appealing, particularly in the South.
Yeah, well, it depends on whether you tie it to ranked choice voting. So you don't tie it to ranked choice voting. The reason why the Voting Rights Act was deployed against multi-member districts is that it was a way to basically exclude minority representation. But if you tie it to ranked choice voting, when I ran, that was one of the planks. It was the support for the Fair Representation Act, which basically says you create multi-member congressional districts and ranked choice voting within those districts, so that you can become a congressman within a district, but not, by appealing to, 30% of the vote. And 30% of the vote would be enough if people allocate their electoral vote in the right way. And that assures that the full diversity of people within a district are going to be represented. And it also removes the concern about gerrymandering, because now the district lines don't matter as much if you've got the multi-member opportunity with ranked choice voting. I totally support that in the context of the House. And we could do that by statute. There's nothing that would stop Congress from doing that.
Well, I'll tell you this. My friend Lindsay Chervinsky, she's got a more radical idea for the Senate. She actually thinks that maybe, these states that the top 4 states ought to have 5 senators. Then the next sort of population 4, 3, that there should be some advantage now given that the Senate is just too, that Wyoming and California shouldn't have the same size representation.
Yeah. Well, she and James Madison, and
well, that's what she brought up. She's like, this was an idea thrown around at the time.
Yeah. Right. I mean, the big block we've got to that is that Article 5 expressly says you can't deny equal representation in the Senate without consent So you could imagine a system where we buy off the small states. We say, we'll give you $100 billion if you'll just allow us to have a Senate that's actually proportional. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Well, and by the way, this would be the opportunity for DC statehood, right?
Yes.
We would have another question about the District of Columbia, which is also in the Constitution.
Yeah.
On that front. Man, Larry, I could keep nerding out on this, but realistically, what do you think I mean, I feel like our politics are so tumultuous these days, and that there's a little bit of an open-mindedness out there that if you told me that we were going to, if I went into a coma and I woke up, hey, there's going to be a constitutional convention in the summer of 2029, it wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, it shouldn't shock you. And I think that, what we need right now are projects where people see that people of very different political stripes can actually agree on something. And,
Right.
I think balanced budget is a harder one, but money in politics is the easiest one. If you all of a sudden said, look, can't we at least agree on that? People would say, yeah. And then all of a sudden we would say, we're not actually totally at our throats for issues. There's a great project out of University of Maryland where they poll on issues, and they have a huge number of issues, which they call gold standard issues, where we actually agree as citizens. But the dynamics of political strategy is that the parties are not going to emphasize the issues we agree on. So we are constantly convinced that we all hate each other, and we don't agree with anything with each other. And that's true for a bunch of important issues, but we ought to at least find a way to talk about and demonstrate we can work together on critical issues. And if we could solve the money in politics problem, the fiscal integrity problem, the fact that you've got people until their 90s in Congress, that would be a pretty important set of victories.
It's funny. I've had quite a few state reps and state senators over the years tell me, I'm like, how, he's like, we agree on he goes, 90% of the bills we vote on are pretty unanimous or close to unanimous. The big fights are over 10%. And I'm like, that's basically Congress. They agree on 90% of the budget every year. The fight is over the last 10%. Now, it's the 10% they disagree on the most, but you're right. There really is. It is one of those things that, compared to a lot of other things, there's more agreement than you realize.
Yes. And we ought to be exploiting it, because that would convince us there's a reason to continue to hang together as a nation, right? Because right now, there are many people who think, like, why are we actually hanging together anymore? Like, aren't we so divided that we should just accept it? And
I got a viewer question about this, about a civil war. And I just said, I sort of logistically don't believe it's going to happen, because unlike the 19th century, we sort of, our divides aren't aligned with geography, right?
Well,
and I think that in a weird way probably keeps us from having a hot civil war versus maybe what we're going through now, which might be a cold cultural civil war.
yeah. But if you think about kind of like extending legs on Canada, right? So on the coasts, you come down each coast, and maybe you reach down to get Minnesota and Illinois somehow. That's pretty geographically manageable. I mean,
I used to say, if you touch a large body of water, you're more likely a blue state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's some South Carolina, Mississippi. I'm not going to sit here and say that there aren't exceptions, but largely that was sort of true for a while. Less so now with Florida and such.
Yeah, but that's not happening. I hope that's not happening. I don't want to see that happen. But there are people who are strategizing on that too.
Larry Lessig, I enjoyed this. I want to stay up to date, not just on this case, this campaign finance case, that would be, like I said, the Luke Skywalker single shot to blow up super PACs. You know who secretly wants to see super PACs go away? The donors.
Of course.
How many donors have you talked to going, boy, I would love to find out it's illegal to have to write a $5 million check.
Oh my gosh.
I'm tired of being asked for it.
One of our biggest supporters, in fact, the first big supporter, said, I am supporting this because I don't think we should have this power. I think it's wrong that rich people have this power. And then 10 minutes later in the conversation, he's like, And boy, if we win, I don't have to be writing all these checks all the time to all these people begging me for money. And it's like, either way, I'm happy. Like, as long as you're supporting the idea of ending it.
Right.
And that's been the most like rewarding. There's a large number of like, we've got a group of right now about 8 billionaires who say, look, we didn't ask for this power. We don't believe we should have this power. We're funding the fight to end us having this power. So spending our money to reduce our own political impact. And I think that's kind of something people ought to see, that like the billionaires are not united in the idea that the fact that people like Elon are allowed to do what they're able to do is a good thing for democracy, because it clearly is not.
No, I think we are where we are due to this perversion of money. It's hard to come to any other conclusion. Larry Lessig, I feel like I got to audit one of your classes at Harvard, so I appreciate it. Good to see you.
Great to see you, Chuck.